Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I think we were all so excited when we saw how many people had registered for today's event, and I think we've all forgotten what this size of people looks like in real life because we're all a bit overwhelmed. It's that sensory overwhelm of so many people in the room, which is awesome to see. Firstly, today, I just want to acknowledge the land that we're standing on today. Springpoint lives and works on the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And today we're continuing the long tradition of storytelling that's been happening in this place for thousands and thousands of years. And we just want to acknowledge that this is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land, and pay our respects to any First Nations people present today and all elders past, present, and emerging.
Thanks very much, Beck, and good morning, everyone. It is great to see such a strong turnout on such a very early morning. So very grateful for the opportunity to be able to host you all today. For those I haven't had the chance to meet just yet, my name is Chris Morfess and I'm a Principal Consultant at Springpoint. And I wanted to help set the scene today for what's going to be a great panel discussion very shortly. The topic came to us through a number of very common conversations that we've been having with clients and folk across our network, which is that we're experiencing a sense of collective burnout across our workforce and we're not sure what to do about it. So we wanted to share some ideas and raise some questions around this to help us better understand exactly what's going on and what it is that we can do to respond. So what are we seeing? There's a number of key business and employee trends that we're seeing dominate the landscape right now. First of all, power sits with the employee. We're seeing record low rates of unemployment, lowest in 50 years. We're seeing labour and skills shortages, and we're seeing pent-up demand. In other words, it's very much an employee's market right now, and you don't have to be a recruitment specialist to have felt the effects of that. Secondly, there's been a clear focus on employee support through the program, throughout the pandemic. We've seen a very strong emphasis on wellness solutions and in some instances, a leadership bias towards care over accountability. Thirdly, great resignation and quiet quitting continues to dominate the headlines. In particular, we're seeing a strong, this coming through in a particularly profound way for our younger generations. We're experiencing somewhat of a values reset as it relates to our Gen Z and younger millennial workers. And as Simon Sinek says, the pandemic has catalysed young people to ask the question, how does work fit into my life, rather than how does life fit into my work? And of course, all of this is happening in the context of a highly competitive external environment. We're seeing businesses need to evolve faster than ever before. We're seeing new go-to-market strategies. We're seeing operating model reform. All the while, we're experiencing a digital transformation that's happening at a faster pace than ever before. We're seeing supply chain challenges. We're seeing commodities and resources being scarce, and all, of course, happening in the backdrop of a looming recession. So in other words, there's lots going on right now. And how do we make sense of all of this? And what is the impact on the employee experience? Global engagement trends are stable but low. Only 21% of global employees are engaged right now. That's according to Gallup's 2022 State of the Workplace report. This is even more pronounced in Australia, where over 80% of us are either not engaged or actively disengaged at work. Interestingly, we're also experiencing the highest annual job mobility rate since 2012, so nearly 10% of us have changed roles. Interestingly again, 42% of workers have stated that their job has become monotonous, repetitive, boring since the pandemic. There's also very remarkable differences in employee well-being. Interestingly, the global rates are low, but in Australia, 63% of employees are thriving at work as it relates to well-being. So how do we make sense of all of these different data points? We're seeing a relatively low level of engagement, reasonably strong well-being, and evidence for a sense of boredom in the workplace. Through our experiences with our clients, we've noticed a really strong uptick in energy off the back of an offsite, off the back of a leadership development program or a capability initiative, or even a hard call back to the office. And that's led us to ask the question, is this really a case of burnout, or is it a case of bored out? So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what burnout and bored out looks like. So there's many different models and many different representations as to what these concepts look like. What we're taking a look at here is the Yerkes-Dodson curve. This is an old school frame and essentially describes that there's a peak level of stress required for optimal energy and performance. At either end of those spectrums, we have boredom and we have burnout. And at its most simplest, burnout can be described as demands outweighing resources. It's where we experience excessive variability in the work that we're doing and a sense of overload too. On the flip side, when we take a look at bored out, at its simplest, this could be described as resources outweighing demands, where we have very low variability in the work that we're doing and a sense of underload. And what does this look like in practice? Well, this presents in organisations as it relates to burnout as fatigue, disengagement, cynicism, irritation, a lack of focus, and in some cases, anxiety. And interestingly, if we look at bored out, the symptoms can look like fatigue, disengagement, cynicism, irritation, lack of focus, and anxiety. So our caution for the audience here today is that this is a very real question that we should be asking. The symptoms can appear very similar, whether we're leaning into a bored out or a burnout situation. However, the causes and the interventions may likely be very different. If we take a slightly closer look at the causes behind each of these ends of the spectrum, if we take bored out, for example, research tells us that through a lack of performance standards and accountability, too many barriers to real collaboration and connection, and a level of siloing that's reducing the visibility, our ability to see a line of sight between the work that we're doing and the impact that that has. On the flip side with burnout, research tells us that it's an excessive level of workload, a lack of prioritisation, organisations where absolutely everything matters. Excessive face time, which overrides meaningful work, and also this sense of constant work vigilance. Which is often connected to this unrelenting commitment to an organisation's mission. So what we're striving for here is an optimal level of energy and performance, the right level of stress, the right conditions to create peak energy and performance. And the question becomes, what can we do to create that? Through our experience with our clients, there's 4 key conditions or levers that we've seen as being particularly important for re-energising workplaces today. First of all, work design. We need an appropriate balance of resources and demands. This is a hygiene factor, and without this condition in place, other interventions become significantly challenged. Secondly, we need to design campaigns of work and embed the right accountabilities that enable us to experience a sense of goal achievement. In other words, we need to create line of sight between what employees are doing and the impact on customers, stakeholders, and society. And lastly, we need to engineer moments for growth, stretch, and learning. These need to be integrated into the flow of work to help stimulate thinking. Next, we have purpose. We need to create and communicate a compelling purpose, one that highlights the social impact of an organisation. Again, this is no longer a nice to have, but something that's becoming a stronger expectation for particularly our younger workers. Lastly, there's work to be done in helping find and discover common ground between our personal purpose and that of our organisation. Leaders have a really strong responsibility to play. They have a clear role to play in helping connect people to purpose. But beyond that, organisations need to help identify and reset on the skills for leading, energising and enabling people and teams. We need to equip leaders with the confidence to lean into exceptional conversations, ones which balance both care and accountability. And we need to establish connection practices that enable ongoing monitoring of both wellbeing and performance. We can't leave that to chance. We need to engineer these connection rhythms. Lastly, connectivity. I'm not sure here who likes Zoom drinks. It's usually not particularly popular, and I'm certainly one of those people. We need to create opportunities for meaningful connection, ones where we're actually coming together on a real problem, one that actually stimulates thinking. There's obviously an energy hurdle that we need to overcome to make that happen too. And again, there's a strong leadership play here. How are we equipping leaders with the narrative, with the words to help sell a compelling vision as to why we need to come together? What's the value of that? What is the value of connecting? And lastly, what role does place have in helping to activate and stimulate new ways of thinking? How we're using offsites, leadership development opportunities, capability cohorts to create a community of practice around a shared goal, and how we're using novel place to help stimulate new ways of thinking and new ways of doing. So when combined, these four components provide a really strong foundation for a re-energised workforce. And hopefully that's sparked a little bit of thinking in the room here today. But to help us get into the main part of today's breakfast, I wanted to introduce to the stage the Managing Director of SpringPoint to lead the conversation. So please welcome Dylan Flavelle.
Wow, round of applause. I haven't done anything. Hey, thanks firstly for everyone being here. I mean, clearly through conversations just early in our proceedings, and even just in the last few minutes, I think that the topic has hit a note. So I'm really pleased to have you all here. Firstly, just a bit of an introduction. So Robin, I've known Robin for, I guess, at least 10 years now. It has been a little while. So Robin has been in a range of executive roles across a number of really large global brands that you'll know of, Goldman Sachs, KordaMentha, but most recently at ASB Bank, which is a subsidiary of Commonwealth Bank in New Zealand. So Robin's been experiencing the pandemic and leading them as their Chief People Officer for the past couple of years. In that time, Robin's always had roles at executive level and has always, largely run the people function. The things that have always stood out to me from the very first time I met Robin is her very, very strong sense of commerciality as a people leader, but someone who also leads people, teams and organisations through a level of alignment and involvement as well. So just balancing that, the commercial needs of an organisation with the people and organisational needs as well. I think the other things that are at a very practical level, as I've become to know Robin, she's a very humble and generous person, and loves her gardening, and often brings various oddments into our office when she's in between jobs. So terrific to have you here, Robin. Next, I'd like to welcome Melanie Storer. So some of you will have met her and some of you may not have. I'm very pleased to share that Mel's just joined us as our Director of Transformation. However, Mel's last couple of years have been working at Good Shepherd as the Director of Transformation and Innovation, so has supported that organisation as they've gone through a really significant transformation. Prior to that, Mel's been in a range of executive roles at Australia Post. She spent time at PwC and a number of other organisations as well, always with a focus on organisational performance, strategy, strategic planning and governance. Okay, so Chris gave a little introduction as to why we chose this topic, and I thought I'd just share a little bit on that. In the last, couple of years, we've noticed a couple of things happening in organisations. Firstly, we do a lot of organisational culture work, and so throughout the pandemic period, what we noticed, and I've had a few conversations this morning that have been similar, is that early on in the pandemic, we saw organisations with engagement and organisational culture and involvement scores and diagnostics really have a significant tick up. So we just saw people and organisations really get involved in what was happening despite the difficult context. As the last couple of years have sort of played out, we've started to see some similar but different trends happening, which is, we've seen engagement start to drop and wane. And certainly in the last, probably 3 to 4 months, I don't know how many conversations I've had with clients, and my general question firstly would be, how are things in the organisation? How does it feel? And almost invariably the answer was, we just feel really burnt out. But then my next question was, what are you doing about that, or what do you think there is to be done about that? And it was probably the first time in my, sort of time working with organisations where I just felt we didn't have a lot of answers, because the answers around wellbeing support had been played out a lot in the first part of the pandemic. So there was just a level of disconnect between what was happening now and what we could do about it, as not just an individual, but as a collective organisation. So it really, prompted this topic, recognising that we see some organisations who are really stretched, as Chris talked about in the health sector, and some that perhaps aren't or are struggling with engagement. So that's the genesis, I guess, of the topic. So I guess just to start off with, Robin, it'd be great to hear the experience of ASB over the last couple of years. In particular, how did the organisation fare through the pandemic period up until the last couple of months when you sort of left?
Thanks, Dylan. It's great to be here. I joined ASB 6 weeks before the pandemic. So I was one of those people who was kind of onboarding and leading the pandemic response, like everyone else who joined during the pandemic. And I was also separated from my family. We thought my family and friends could come and visit me and I could live in New Zealand. Little did we know that 4 quarantine periods later, 3 in New Zealand, locked in a hotel for 2 weeks, and 1 in Australia. So I sort of personally went on the journey that a lot of our people went on as well. A couple of things were really interesting for me. Our people turned to us for things across the whole range of their life that they wanted support in. So, it wasn't just the transactional or some support around flexible work. We stopped arguing about flexible work. We stopped arguing about remote work, although we're having those arguments again, aren't we, about how do we get people into the office. But that was all behind us. But people turned to us for support, financial security. They turned to us for guidance on health and wellbeing. Even though the government was giving that, they waited. And they waited, and twice a week, a message would go out telling people what to do, where to turn up, how were we going to help them, committing to job security, even though we were uncertain. And this was in a climate in which the banks were expected to support society, which was our purpose and continues to be the purpose of ASB today, to support the financial wellbeing of all New Zealanders. So we had all these government and social expectations, and then we had our people saying, I'm juggling schooling, I need to be paid but I can't work. I'm juggling schooling, how do you do this? You tell me how to do this. I'm at home, I'm lonely, and I've got no one else in my flat. Or I've got a multi-generational family in my house. There are 8 of us and 3 of us are trying to work. So we had all these expectations to deliver, also in conjunction with what we already had on the agenda. So this wasn't a dump your agenda for transformation, dump your services to clients and just focus on health and wellbeing. It was very much an and. And what we saw was we were exposed to people's lives. I mean, we've all seen it on the Teams meetings where the kids and the dogs are there too, and you include them in the decision-making discussions. So the whole world really transformed, and we were on the job all the time. The big challenge we found was that people became unable to set boundaries. So that was great, they could work from home, but some of them sacrificed that commute time as discretionary effort for the company. So that was another 2 hours a day they were working. Others took that back to look after themselves, but basically had so many personal responsibilities. So our experience was very much, how can we be counsellor, mentor? How can we guarantee job security to people, including those who refused to be vaccinated and we couldn't have them going to see their clients? The expectations, I think, of employers were just much greater. The interesting thing during the pandemic was ASB has historically always had global best practice in engagement levels and adherence to values. So we benchmarked globally and we sat in the top quartile, and during the pandemic that became stronger. So our engagement scores, our employees' confidence in our adherence to values, all those things became stronger. But we had debates. For example, we said to everyone, we will pay you whether you can work or not. So tell us if you're unable to work, so we know, but we will pay you. And then we got to the end of the first lockdown, which, I don't know, felt like it went forever. And of course, we had some people who hadn't done paid work for the bank for months and hadn't taken any leave. We gave people full pay without asking them to take leave. And then we had other people who'd worked round the clock. And so you have that question of, how do you monitor that in an equitable way and have everyone feel that they are supported? And we were asking a lot more of leaders because they had to solve a lot of that within their own team. We couldn't solve that through policies and scrutinising people's work from head office, so to speak. So there's some of the challenges that ASB faced.
I guess the main thing that stands out to me there is just that very changed role and expectation of an employer to support employees. I mean, I guess if we were to wind back sort of 50 years, that would be unimaginable, to think of that. And clearly it was a health crisis and primarily a human issue. So that response felt right. We'll dig in a little bit. I'd love to hear a little bit about how that support continued, perhaps towards the latter sort of last 6 or 12 months. But I might ask you, Mel, how Good Shepherd experienced the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Robin, similar to you, we went through those similar challenges with respect to how do we respond, what is the role of an employer and what is the role of a leader in the organisation. As an organisation that is providing services to the vulnerable community, our actual demand around our services increased. So we had increases in domestic violence as a result of lockdowns. We had a whole cohort of clients emerging, a whole vulnerable cohort of clients emerging that had never tapped into the community sector organisations. So the organisation, particularly our counsellors, our case managers, our social workers, those providing clinical services, their work went up and their responsibilities went up and their absolutely unrelentless commitment to client outcomes didn't waver. So what we saw there was deep, deep commitment. And at that time, what we were trying to do, obviously, is respond and keep our workforce safe. So how do we have a social sector organisation trying to deliver services that are generally place-based and bringing in different delivery channels? So how do you safely bring that online, but how do you stack up that capability really fast as well? Like, we stood up a contact centre in 6 weeks and tried to, deliver service to the extent that you can without compromising the outcome for a client in that time as well. So, in this sort of burnt out board conversation, what we did have was also a workforce that were acutely aware of the symptoms of clinical burnout and able to identify that in themselves as well. So I think, like I said, sort of similarities. I started just before, similar to you, about sort of probably 2 months into the pandemic, and as the role of Director of Transformation, I was there to set up the transformation program. So we've got increased demand, increased delivery, record services. We'd just gone through a merger. The organisation over those 3 years quadrupled employment size, quadrupled revenue and quadrupled government funding. And then we had the transformation program standing up beside it as well. So for the leaders beyond the clinical, beyond our clinical services, we're also trying to build the foundations and catch up the scale of building a sustainable organisation for the future while responding to that community crisis as well. So yeah, I think we felt it across various levels, and as a human organisation, very empathetic, I think, in how we tried to support our employees through that as well.
Terrific. So I guess maybe digging in a little bit to our topic, because I heard through both of your narratives there, how did you, Robin, see, did you experience both seeing levels of burnout within people, teams, functions, areas of the business, and did you also see the opposite? Did you see any levels of disengagement? I know you shared there that there was really high levels of engagement. So I'm interested in what did you see and how did you know that they were happening? Obviously, the burnout is perhaps a little easier to diagnose.
Yeah, and as Chris said, the symptoms look the same. So working out, is it burnout or is it boredom, is a really big challenge. We had frontline people in our call centres in particular. That was really an area where it was pretty clear to us that was burnout. They wanted to help our customers. We had a lot of customers, losing their jobs, uncertain about the future, wanting to restructure their finances. And the call centres couldn't be taken remotely for a number of months after. We didn't have the technology a lot of the banks had. So for those people, we did quite a lot of additional appreciation. We also did a lot of hiring out of Air New Zealand, took advantage of those travel companies that had great services and were laying people off. That was a really great support for us. We held tightly on pay rises, but what we did prioritise was that financial rewards went to those frontline people and our lowest paid people. So they were prioritised first, and then middle management and above, which is quite a big part of the bank, were not given pay rises in 2020 and were still given their bonuses, but were not given base pay rises. They were prioritised for others. We also had the leadership at the very top level, so the executive team that I was a part of personally spent time both virtually and then personally when we could with those frontline people, recognising and rewarding what they were doing. One of the challenges we found though, and I think it's the same in Australia, Aussies and Kiwis hoard annual leave. And we could not get people to take annual leave. They didn't feel like it was a holiday. So we did shift very quickly to closing down. We used to close down for about 10 days for most of our employees. Clearly branches, you can't do that. And we moved that to a 3-week closure. And what that helped us to do in relation to burnout was that despite there was some complaints, people were delighted to come back because so many people were on leave. You didn't come back to 5,000 emails. You actually did have a break, and that became a really welcome thing to do. So it was really challenging. The other burnout piece was really just around being on Teams all day long. Everyone found that challenging, and what we found was that when people weren't well, because they were working from home, they thought they could still work. And I actually had to take people aside and say, I'm turning your screen off in this meeting. You've said you're sick, you look sick, and you're running a town hall or attending a town hall with 200 people across the bank saying that it's okay to come to work when you're sick. And coming to work is turning up on a screen. So we did have to say to people, I'm sorry, but you're not allowed back on any system for a week because they were sick and they were coming to work. And that wasn't just executives setting a bad example, they were bad, but it was rank and file, people feeling like I don't want to let the clients down. So boredom, I think, is a different thing. My biggest concern is early career employees. Much of what you learn is from experience, coaching, someone saying, hey, come to this meeting with me, you'll find it really interesting. They weren't getting that. And in the second lockdown in 21, we had over 10% of our employees had been hired and started in that 6-month period. They'd never kind of just dropped into the office. They'd never had that routine of building relationships. So we really had to support leaders with a toolkit around how to have conversations, and we would set some principles which were basically make your decisions about how to work about as a team based on, firstly, what does the customer need, internal and external. Secondly, talk about your team and your personal routines and what will work. And then thirdly, work out what's going to work for you as an individual. So we did have to equip leaders. You know, you mentioned, Mel, what you expect of a leader is different. We did have to equip leaders to problem solve and have really open conversations.
To that point, I mean... Oh, hello, thank you. To that point, I know, you know, we didn't want today to be purely about hybrid work, but I know from talking to people in the audience at the start of today, you know, I know that that's a key thing on people's minds, going, how do we get that right? Did you find that, and I think that what you just narrated, you know, the organisation, the customer, the team, personal, was it sort of in that order that you should be making decisions, was almost prioritised based on those layers? And I guess my question is, did that get it right? Because I know organisations have been grappling with this, particularly over the last 6, 12 weeks, 3 months. You can see organisations going, we're still not getting there. So how did that work?
Well, it only works if you're prepared to review it regularly. So, we gave them the toolkit for the sorts of questions to ask, how to create an environment where the team can have that conversation. But then, of course, what happens is someone's kids get sick, their partner loses their job, they have carer responsibilities, and what they said this week isn't okay anymore. So those were really ongoing dialogues. Some leaders did it really well. Some leaders, and I'll call out the introverts, I sit right in the middle of introversion, extroversion. Some introverts were just delighted to stay at home in their study and never see another live person again. And we had to say to them, look, we get that. You don't have to be an extrovert. You don't have to go to drinks. But you do have to get comfortable with creating an environment where you can say, this is where I'm at and how I'm feeling. If you need more time from me, please speak up, and to help everyone else with their conversations. So it was an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because the place that you're working connects so deeply to some of the things we were talking about as triggers for getting this balance right. Purpose, connectivity, work design. They can all be done in virtual and remote environments, but certainly differently. What about you, Mel? At Good Shepherd, you certainly talked to the fact that you saw a level of heightened activity, in a purpose-led organisation. Interested to know whether you also saw the opposite. Did you see any level of disconnect or trying to get the balance right for some that might have been at the other end of the continuum?
Yeah, I think we definitely saw both ends. I think particularly from the causes and some of those symptoms and behaviours that Chris spoke to earlier. So frontline staff, clinical presence, amazing commitment to work and amazing leadership approach as well. Like the supervision training that a clinical practitioner has does not waver because they're used to managing through and leading through those types of conditions. I think for the other part of the organisation, we definitely started to see fatigue, and we saw levels of disengagement. And I think that was largely around probably related to where the organisation was at. As I mentioned before, just gone through a significant merger, quadrupling in size, both in revenue and staff, and then big cross-functional transformation projects as well. So the requirement to work together was at a level that we hadn't had before. And that paradox, I guess, and the way that work needed to be done had not been defined, and then COVID hit. So where you have cross-functional projects, and there's also cross-sector within the organisation. So you have academics, you have social workers, and you have a really strong business discipline that the board are committed to bring that sort of uplift around capability and sophistication. And that way of working had not quite been embedded well before it then moved online. So you didn't have the connectivity around the ways of working or the connectivity around the work that needed to be done. And then, so I think that way of working was not strong to then support the type of, flux that the pandemic brought. And, so I think that sort of played out, and it taken a lot of orchestration that probably you wouldn't need to perhaps intervene in the way that was necessary, because those sort of disciplines and relationships and practices and just operating rhythms weren't in place. And I think that played out in fatigue. And then as this sector, so the for-purpose sector, similar to innovation, similar to engineering, similar to technology, and similar to organisations that are in that growth trajectory, you're responding to funding. So you can be seen to be sort of switching and changing priorities because it's the nature of where the organisation's at a given point in time. So I think if you're not very carefully explaining and communicating the change in direction or the change in priorities and really engaging the workforce in deeply explaining the rationale behind that, that risk of disconnect or that risk of sort of change fatigue tends to sort of surface a little bit more.
So maybe just a couple more questions I'd like to ask before I might give people and groups the chance to again connect and come up with some questions for the panel. But a few of the things we talked about, and there are more that contribute to getting that sort of optimal level of stress right, that we know. One is what you just referred to there, Mel. It's this idea of purpose and meaningful work, which clearly at Good Shepherd is a biggie. This this fundamental need for connectivity. There's probably two different parts to that too, of course. One being what you just described, connectivity of the work, cross-functional work, which is becoming so important, but also connectivity at a human level. And then this other thing of sort of work design, how you get the right amount of work across a big organisation and continue to be able to have the agility. So I'm across that to get that right. So I'm just interested, I guess, on your reflections on any of those, purpose, connectivity or work design, areas where you feel whether you got it right or practices that worked or didn't for both you, Mel and Robin. So maybe start with you, Mel.
Yeah, I think, obviously purpose, in an organisation, a for-purpose organisation, people are deeply committed to the purpose. They're motivated by the purpose and they will usually unwavering towards that purpose. I think connectivity in a human organisation as well, that's sort of really strong. I think one of the more important parts there for us was around the work design. So how are you engaging people across the entire organisation with a transformation program that was touching and going through every layer of the organisation? And one of the things we really tried to focus on there was removing people from their roles and looking at the capability, looking at the experience, looking at the skill, both sort of from an expertise, so probably a subject matter expert skill, but also just the skill of leadership, of championing change, of collective behaviour and looking at those types of things and thinking about the work and thinking how you connect those aspects of talent and aspects of, like I said, sort of subject matter technical expert to get the work done. And I think that created a level of energy as well and also just a different way of working. Like it wasn't I'm coming to this meeting or I'm involved in this project because that's my job. It was because, it's something of interest, it's something you have experience in, and it's something that you can help sort of lead and really, I guess push forward as well.
I guess at its base level, it's how do you connect the work that needs to be done with people rather than boundaried roles and have agility through that.
Excitement about it as well. Like it is, it's hard. Like it is hard. The whole pandemic was hard. Everyone was feeling that. But trying to sort of get excitement and motivation around organisational transformation did require that sort of continual, trying to ignite excitement in that work and sort of connection and motivation to the work as well.
We were talking about it before. I was saying, well, the purpose-led organisation probably does really naturally push that trigger of just high intensity and commitment of work, which can potentially lead to to burnout. What about you, Robin? Interested in your views?
Yeah, ASB is a very purpose-led organisation and very focused on contributing to the financial well-being of all New Zealanders and advancing their progress. So the important thing around purpose is really that people feel it's lived, it's not just written up. And for our new people joining the bank, how do they experience that? So one of the things that's really tempting to do is to sort of wind back on some of those giving activities that have been embedded in the organisation, because you're sort of thinking, how do we support everyone? They've got enough on their plate. But actually we maintain that and increase that involvement. Our people were very focused on the fact that no matter where they sat within the organisation, they were very privileged to be guaranteed employment security right through the pandemic. So they knew we were not going to restructure or lay people off, and they wanted to contribute to the rest of New Zealand society, which was experiencing that. So we maintained our fundraising. When we were able to, between lockdowns, people went and made sandwiches for kids in the underprivileged schools. They distributed and fundraised for families that were struggling, and really were given time to continue to live our purpose and to see that that wasn't something we picked up and dropped, dependent on whether we were profitable or not. And look, we were very careful financially, and the outcome of that is ASB made a lot of money and contributed over $1 billion in profit to Commonwealth Bank both years. In fact, the most recent one was $1.4 billion. So it wasn't an organisation that was struggling, but we actually didn't know as we went through the pandemic whether we would be forced to change course, whether we would need to cut costs significantly or lay people off. But we made a commitment, we backed that, and then we enabled our people to help other people in New Zealand through continuing the sort of charitable and contribution to society type work.
And I suspect that created a lot of trust, did it, in the workplace as well? And it's
Yeah.
how you foster that trust now.
Absolutely, and I think there was that confidence that our adherence to the values we had, a core one was caring, and ASB is known to be what's called, they say, we're whānau. Whānau in New Zealand, for the Kiwis here, is family. And so, you know, we needed to treat our employees like family, we needed to demonstrate that, not talk it, and then we needed to treat all New Zealanders like part of a bigger family that needed to get through that. So that trust was absolutely a big part of it.
Okay, so last question, which will be one we can sort of start to dig into, but also as groups we can perhaps dig into it as well. And I guess it really relates to the fact that, you know, we've just described a few things. One is that new role of an employer giving a lot of support to employees in ways that perhaps we haven't done as much before. But then we've got a skills and capacity shortage, which means, as Chris shared before, you've got perhaps a balance of power with employee. It's an employee's market. If we think about this idea of boredom, is the elephant in the room here when we think about that segment of some organisations or some industries, is part of the challenge there that it's just a real. It's difficult to sort of really address that group and the performance tension, which is probably what we're talking about, a tension between performance and support, or however you want to describe that. Is that an elephant in the room, do you think, for many organisations? Maybe not necessarily the ones you're talking about now, but is that something that we need to start to lean into a little bit? Maybe Robin, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because since I've been back in Australia for the last couple of months, I've been able to observe some organisations. I've got a 25-year-old son, first job working from home. It's really interesting, the organisations that use technology to know what you're doing at all times. And for young people who are starting out in their working life, and they have, he started work 2 weeks before the first lockdown here in Melbourne, and they don't have that experience, and they're just dying to get into work, and they don't want to wear a suit, but they want to look smart and they want to be part of something bigger than sitting at home on their computer. And I really observed recently, I was at Healesville at the RACV Club, and there was a conference with a lot of, I can call them young people, early career people, and it was a work conference, and they were having such a great time in a relaxed way, just kind of enjoying being part of something, enjoying belonging somewhere other than with family and their mates. And I do worry that we think work is a transactional thing. We think technology is great because the employer knows exactly when they clock on, when they clock off, what they're doing, and all the conversations are via Teams, and they're not ringing each other very often. But actually, I think that leads to boredom because we underestimate the importance of feeling like you belong to something bigger. And it's not that people just need work. I think corporations actually, it suits them to say, find the thing you love and you'll never work a day in your life, and to make work seem bigger than it is. But people do want to belong in different ways, and particularly starting out, those people in the first few years in their career, going to a new organisation, changing, the connectivity is as important as the work. And if you don't have the connectivity, it doesn't matter what the bits of work are. It's just someone shoving stuff at you, and you're looking at a screen with 7 faces on it, and you're halfway down the pecking order or further, and everybody's your boss asking you where stuff is. So you can do all that if you have a lot of fun together, if you respect each other and you've had some relaxed times. But if you don't, it takes the joy out of your working day. And please don't think I'm complaining about my son's work, but you get an insight into someone working in a different organisation, and you can see how challenging it is. So is it the work content, or is it the fact that there aren't creative spaces to connect and find new ways of doing things that leads to boredom and burnout? It's a real challenge.
Yeah, well, it's terrific reflections, Robin, and there's a lot of different angles on that. What about you, Mel? Just thinking about this sort of performance and sort of support well-being continuum. I'm interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah, I think you gave a really good example of that before, Robin, where you clearly invested in providing support services for the employees, and that created a whole lot of trust. And as many organisations have, and many organisations also trying to remove some of those some of those support systems that didn't exist before. And people are saying, but what are you going to replace that with? And there's become a dependency on those. And how do you break that dependency? And I mean, my sort of sense on this is it's that trust has been created, and how do you foster that trust and use that trust to engage now that workforce in a meaningful way? And connectivity to the work, I think, is one, but I think that I do believe that leaders need to face into this and step up to this and motivate for the change and acknowledge that this is the situation and these are the challenges that we've got, and we need to build connectivity around the work, we need to build purpose around the work, and we need to build a way of working for people to come together and do the work as well. So I think there is a tension. I think the concept of performance, it means different things now in organisations as well. We're hearing a lot around, it was about performance, now it's about impact. Performance was a lot easier to measure. Impact is more difficult to measure. I think trying to define what it is we're trying to shift to. So if it is performance or it is impact, how do you measure it, and then how you're taking the workforce through that.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting one in our planning for this and talking to a number of clients. One of the key questions that I can sort of pose, but you can feel free to be wide-ranging in your discussion with your groups, but it was that perhaps, as Chris shared before, we might be misdiagnosing or lumping all things into burnout generally. But I guess the challenge that sort of Mel sort of gets to there is how do we, it's become almost a well-worn discussion. It's going, we're burnt out. And so I guess the challenge then becomes, how do we change that narrative, recognising that sometimes that is absolutely the case, but then how do we go, well, let's make sure that we understand that at an organisational, at a team and at an individual level, and recognise what we might be able to do that might be a bit different to what we're doing at the moment, because it feels like it does need to be addressed, and I'm not sure that Christmas holidays will do it. I guess that's perhaps the in some ways the implicit reflection is that, well, maybe when we get to have a break, it'll be fine, and when the sun comes out again. So that might be a bit of fuel for thought for your discussion. So feel free to lean into your little groups there, and if you want to have a chat to other groups in and around you, feel free to do that. So we're going to give you 15 or 20 minutes to explore some angles on what we've heard up here now, and then ask some questions of our panel. So take it easy and have a chat. Okay, so some lively discussion there. So we thought we might send a few mics around to get some of your questions that might start to fill in a few of the gaps that you felt were in the discussion, or that you'd just like to dig a bit deeper on. So any of the groups want to start off with a burning question for Robin or Mel?
Hi, thank you. I just had a question around, I think there's a bit of an assumption that when we talk about the burnout versus the bored out, my mind immediately leans that your younger generation and your earlier workers will lead more towards the bored out side, and that burnout will go for the people that have had longer tenure within the organisation. Would you be able to expand on that a little and advise where you think that either is or isn't true?
If you want to start, Robin, I mean, I know you alluded to before, it wasn't an assumption around that, but it was more an observation about early career development but being challenged, particularly if you hadn't met colleagues before, maybe, or you hadn't spent much time in and with people. So
yeah, the burnout we saw more with mid-career and above, but also with the front line, which I imagine is what's happening in health and helping professions. So for a bank, the front line's your call centre and your people in the branches. And so the pressure on them was relentless. You put the phone down and there's calls backed up constantly, there's queues outside the branch. So we did see the burnout more there. The boredom was for those people who were really wanting development. They'd either started a new job and were looking to build their skills and weren't getting that. You know, if you do the experience, education, exposure triangle, most of what you learn and develop through are those experiences. So your early career people, particularly important because they may not get the experience of feeling like they belong to a workplace that has a purpose that they can galvanise around. And I guess given the current employment market, they can just bail out, but that's a kind of unhappy experience of working, isn't it? If you just say, actually, I can get another job somewhere, it doesn't really always solve the problem.
So I think you're saying it's a little bit spec'd firstly based on where in the organisation you see that, but also the driving motivation for particular people, but that may be influenced by their career stage and their integration into an organisation. Because one of the things you shared before, Robin, was going, people have joined an organisation. They might be early in the organisation, not early career necessarily, but the difficulty of trying to really embed into that organisation and the work there and the purpose. What about you, Mel?
I think the thing I'd probably just add to that, so that because I naturally went to that generational lens as well, definitely, and I think the sort of intervention or the different perspective on that is the solution or how you would solve for that around the connectivity to the work and the design of the work and the role of the leader in leading the work is probably the same irrespective of generation. And I think, you know, wherever you sit on that spectrum, I think approaching it that way probably is, you know, it goes to connectivity, so the relationships around it as well is probably how I'd think about it.
Yeah, I guess we do know, maybe my little add to that, I guess we do know that, you know, for those in their first probably decade of work have experienced a different organisational and work life than perhaps those who've been in the workforce for 20 plus years, where, you know, tenure now is certainly shorter than perhaps it was a longer time ago. So therefore the currency of younger workers is development and relevance of skill and experience.
Yeah, I think one of the things with connectivity as well is that if you don't feel connected and comfortable, you're not going to raise the fact that you feel burnt out. You're not going to raise the fact that you feel bored. So organisations will lose people because it'll be like, well, you know, that person, my boss seems really distant, I haven't really settled, I'll just look for another job. And they can do that readily. So I think, again, that connectivity enables you to have the conversations to solve the problem. But if you don't have the conversations, then you see it as binary. I'll stay or I'll go.
Level, if it's burnout or if it's boredom, if you're not having the conversation, you don't know. So I think at the crux of it, that's what it does come down to, is really having the conversation with individuals and connecting with individuals around what's going on for them.
Yeah, good question. What other questions have we got from teams or the audience? Don't be shy. It's okay.
Good morning. My name is Justin. We're from Tandem Partners, which is a boutique HR recruitment specialist here in Melbourne. Questions for Robin. A lot of our conversations with candidates and clients in people and culture is about the burnout within their own teams, given all of the work that's gone on the last couple of years supporting the wider business. Were there any sort of successful strategies you had, Robin, for your own team in terms of supporting them through their own challenges?
Yeah, it is a really interesting question. There was an article in the last probably 6 months which talked about particularly senior HR people leaving the profession. And I think HR people are really interesting because we have a broad range of interests. Lots of us either have or dream about that side gig. And so we do usually have some ideas of other things we can do and a sense of how to navigate the market. Interestingly, during the pandemic, I would say the engagement levels of the team I led, cone of silence, I'll admit this, were the lowest engagement levels that I had of any team I've led. And I've always been very proud of leading a team that was highly engaged. We did a range of things. I mean, we did the things you'd expect. They impacted in some respects, but not as much as I would have liked. So those were to do with time that I spent individually. I offered everyone time to talk about career, to talk about where they were at. I scheduled time to talk with everyone in the team, and I had probably all up nearly 100 team members, so I had a routine of check-ins with team members one-on-one, drop-ins with teams, celebrations and recognition, and also monitoring wellbeing and creating the opportunity for team members to have time out of the workplace and enforcing that. And out of the workplace, I mean out of the work role. But it was really challenging at a personal level, and probably partly because I was separated from my family. I felt I had to actively manage my own mental health. So I had a schedule where, as a preventative thing, I made sure I did certain exercise. Unlike most people, I gave up alcohol during the pandemic. I felt living alone, it was a pretty slippery slope, so thought I should just leave that one right alone. And I also structured that I needed to every weekend have FaceTime with particular, family and friends, and I shared that with my own team members. This is what it is for me. It's okay for you to say you need to work on this stuff. It's a challenge for all of us. And that created an environment where they could open up and I could understand what was happening for them and give them permission to invest in themselves.
Thank you.
Terrific question. Other questions? Any other things people want to explore? We've still got a few minutes, so definitely got some time.
Hi, everybody. Morning. I have a question around, we started with the Simon Sinek quote around how does work fit into my life, which has really sat with me during the morning. And sometimes when organisations kind of hear that, I sense like a bit of fear of that shift of power rather than kind of maybe leaning into it and embracing it. And as a panel, you've talked a lot about, connectivity and how do you foster that and breed that. So should we be trying to do more or rather than take those elements away that we talked about that we provided in the pandemic, are there different ways that we could connect in with people outside of work to kind of bring work and life together a little bit more to foster that creativity or connection?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there's so many different angles on this, isn't there, where there was reflections through that period of time that work and life became too integrated and we couldn't get away, but then at the same time we're trying to get this synchronicity and complementariness between those two, and so I think there are lots of angles on this. Interested in our panel's views on this one, Mel?
Yeah, I think, yes, that shift of power has definitely moved. We've gone much more from the employer to the employee. And, I think it's where we're at now. It's about finding the common goal, like finding what is the common outcome that the employee and the employer works, because both of those objectives are important. Obviously, the organisation, if the organisation isn't performing, then the organisation won't continue and exist. Whereas as an employer, you're not going to be your best at work every day if you're not bringing your best to work. So we have spoke a lot about connectivity. I think it is being relatively explicit around that common goal and that common, that sort of common central point that brings everyone together. I think what the pandemic has done has opened up or given permission for that conversation. I think people are more openly having that conversation about what they need at an individual level. And I think at the moment, you've got various organisations going along that continuum as to where that sort of power balance lies. And
yeah, I think the thing that you sort of reflect on there, and I think it's a great question, is that often I think as humans we tend to want to think in binary terms. We tend to want to go, is it about organisational performance, or is it about how we support employees and they are the lifeblood of our organisation? And of course it's trying to find the connectivity between both. We know that it's been a really hard time for leaders and people leaders, line managers, whatever term you want to give them, over the last period of time. I was talking to someone, one of our friends from CPA actually during the break there, just started saying that one of the challenges, I guess, over this period of time is that it's not a set and forget. And I think what we've seen, my observation just as a practitioner over this period of time, previous to the pandemic, every year or two you'd go, oh, what are the themes for this next year or two? And, right now you go, oh, if we were going to have a talking point in one of these events in 6 weeks, there will be a new narrative. It just feels like that gets sped up. So I guess I just reflect on that around the need, I suppose, for leaders and individuals to be much more frequently connected to getting that balance right and understanding how those two things connect, like around personal development. You talk about goal and even values alignment. We just know that when individuals and organisations are aligned in values, maybe what's on the wall perhaps, but in a real way that you talked about before, Robin, needing that continuity, we just know that leads to healthy people and healthy organisations.
We're seeing it a little bit, I think, just that sort of movement along the continuum with the return to work conversation. I mean, everyone went remote and then there was an encouragement to come back to the office, and that encouragement meant to, sort of suggested team days where teams had come together, and then, largely that wasn't working for organisations. And definitely in the conversations I've had today and outside of today is organisations are now moving towards sort of starting to mandate people coming back to the office to sort of force that connectivity. Now, it'll be interesting to see where that goes to, because you can see how fast that has moved and the role that individuals and organisations have both played in that conversation. And this shift to mandate, I mean, it could go back the other way. Like, I don't think it's like this gets mandated and then that's the answer. I think it will be just that continual, continual looking, continual diagnostic, continual reset of what the organisation needs and what the individual needs until that sort of perfect point is probably found.
We're just still learning.
Yeah, we are. I think absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, terrific question. So I think we've got time for maybe one or two more before we finish up.
Thanks. Less a question, more a reflection on fairness being the baseline that we need to operate from when we think about coming in at certain times, what works for everyone, but noting that there are a lot of imbalances, say, between a senior executive's state of well-being and life versus our frontline teams. I wondered if you had any reflections on that, seeing from the vantage point you have, sort of what the difference is from those frontline people versus others in sort of, and how do we embed fairness throughout the processes?
It's a good question. I've certainly heard you reflect a little bit on different groups. Robin, I don't know if you've got any shares there?
Question of how do you get the balance between what life is like for the frontline versus the rest of the organisation was really an ongoing one for us through the pandemic, and then it kind of highlighted what we should be thinking about later because they're such an important part of the workforce. We basically engaged with them because what we found was, for example, the frontline couldn't have that 2 weeks or 3 weeks annual leave enforced, and a lot of them would have liked that. So we gave them additional annual leave as a compensation, not because we said that's what you want, but because they said we would like a recognition of the fact that we can't do this, so we negotiated with them. I think the important thing is to recognise what that group value, so they get enormous satisfaction in going the extra mile for customers. They really do have a sense of a mission to their work separate from, the broader mission of advancing the well-being of all New Zealanders. They do get motivated by that, but they need the recognition and the reward. So the other thing was every member of the executive team was a sponsor for one of the districts and the frontline people, and so it was the obligation of that executive team member to build personal relationships with the branches. My first year, I was the executive sponsor for all the branches in Auckland district, which was 7, so I would have both virtual and physical meetings whenever possible with them, and then I was the sponsor for the call centre. So what I did with the call centre was, rather than just have meetings with them, talk to them about their biggest challenges and then take those back and help problem solve, not because I had the answer, but I could clear the path for them to get the support they needed. So one of the things we did through the pandemic in bringing lots of new people into the bank to deal with the barrage of calls to the front line was actually deploy the most experienced people to become coaches rather than just answer the volume of calls. So they got career development, the new people coming in were supported, and they felt that we understood there were special challenges to their role. So, you know, there's sort of ways you can navigate, but it's no good sitting in head office and saying, actually, I think you could benefit from this, or we're going to give you some little gift. You actually need to know them enough to work out what's going to be valued.
Terrific. It's a great perhaps question and maybe reflection to almost land on where we are at time, which I guess was the sort of starting. Oh, we've got one more question, have we? Sorry, we've got one more question.
Thanks, Dylan. It's probably more an observation. So as leaders, especially today, and you know, we've learnt through the pandemic, leading with empathy and compassion to drive performance and or impact, whatever you choose to define, I think it's really important. We talked a little bit yesterday in one of the sessions that, you know, how do you stop yourself from being sympathetic as opposed to empathetic? So it's probably more of an observation, or I'm not sure if you've got any comments around that, but empathy and compassion actually does drive performance. What's your point of view around that?
Yeah. One of the things that I really believe is that if you have trust, which is built through empathy, you can actually give people feedback about anything. You can give people the most challenging news, the most challenging feedback. One of the things I found very helpful when I moved out of the helping profession, so I trained in psychology and counselling and worked in the getting disabled people into employment as the first decade of my career. One of the things that I've always advised HR people and leaders to do is a basic counselling course, which teaches you how to reflect back what you've heard, which is not sympathy, it's understanding the place people are coming from so that you do build that connection, you do understand their point of view, you can acknowledge that, and then you can share the way forward with them. So I think there are skills that leaders need that anyone working in a people and culture function can really use to put yourself in a place where that person is, and then work out a meeting place where you can develop a plan to move forward. So I agree with you. Empathy is so critical.
We actually did a similar program just at Good Shepherd where we had senior leaders go through a counselling program, and it is really powerful because it is acknowledging that it's not about there are a new skill set required of leaders and a new expectation of leaders, and helping them be able to engage with their workforce in a different way to problem solve was where that sort of came from.
And the important thing is, let's keep the boundaries here. You're not their therapist, but to hear them and help them take accountability for planning is really helpful.
I think we're at time. I think a great way to wrap up, I think one of the central premises of this topic was we know it's a range of things. Let's recognise that we need to be curious about that and think of different ways rather than perhaps loading everything into one area or part of that spectrum or continuum. So firstly, be great if you could put your hands together for Mel and Robin for their time. Thank you so much. Now, we've just got to ask, if you've got a moment, we're going to ask you two little Menti questions, and Rick's going to